This was not supposed to be her journey. Josie Duggar was introduced to the world as a small, frail infant who was born months too soon, and was surrounded by cables and equipment that hummed through the silent evenings of a hospital in Arkansas. Every breath was a miracle, every heartbeat a glimmer of hope, and her parents prayed over her every hour. Nobody was certain that she would survive to celebrate her first birthday. However, she did. Josie, the child of survival and the live example of how faith can overcome all obstacles, became the family's living miracle from that very moment. She was never simply another Duggar kid as she grew up. She was light to the family. She was a fragile yet unbreakable emblem to the globe. Her smile seemed to be captured on video every time, like a fragment of heaven itself. However, beneath that radiant grin was something that no one could see. The silent burden of being the miracle. The person who must always be flawless. She was raised with high standards and few rules. Her parents were strong yet gentle in their devotion. Every choice and every dream had to align with the family's beliefs, principles, and public persona. Josie took it all in stride. She was gentle, obedient, and appreciative. But occasionally, she pondered what it meant to lead a life that was genuinely her own in the silence of her chamber. Zach then arrived. He wasn't a cameraman. He didn't come from a well-known family. He was well known for his modest heart more than his name, and he worked quietly in a little village outside of Fayetteville. He met Josie by chance at a church youth event, when friendship and faith blended together and laughter and hymns were shared. She was just another young girl to him, bashful, smiling, and exuding an innocence he couldn't quite put his finger on. He was unusual to her, not because he was attractive or appealing, but rather because he saw her as a human person rather than as the Duggar miracle or a child on TV. They began by exchanging brief remarks about the Bible, charity, and the future. But gradually, they developed into something more profound. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't prearranged. It was genuine, uncomplicated, and pure. Josie had a sensation she had never experienced before: freedom. Independence within herself, not independence from her family. She didn't need to be flawless, strong, or the miracle that everyone remembered in order to be with Zach. Perhaps she is Josie. However, love wasn't easy in a household like hers. It had guidelines, a schedule, and permission. And there were instant reactions when rumors started to circulate that Josie, the youngest Duggar and still very young, might be falling in love. Her parents were in disbelief. Her siblings guarded her. And it exploded in the outside world. Oh, the world. Social media is full of criticism. It's wrong. He's taking advantage. She's too young. Her heart was unknown to them. They were blind to the silent, introspective evenings she prayed and asked God to confirm her intuition. Zach didn't flee. He didn't dispute. He just stood next to her. He gently but firmly explained to her that patience, faith, and respect were more important in a relationship than age or approval. He didn't push. She was always willing to give everything he asked for. Josie cried more nights than she could remember, though. She loved Zach in a way that defied logic, but she also loved her family, her beliefs, and her reputation. She didn't want to let anyone down. She didn't want to come across as disobedient or lost. Still, her heart wouldn't stop beating. The tension increased over the next few months. Her mother made an effort to keep her safe. For her clarity, her father prayed. The globe no longer saw the entire story as the cameras remained silent. Josie's spirit was preparing a storm that only she knew about. She felt a sense of calm whenever she saw Zach, which led her to think that perhaps God had penned this love long before anyone else did. She started composing private, discreet letters that she never intended to share. She revealed her anxieties in them. I don't wish to cause harm to anyone. However, I can't continue to act as though my heart isn't aware of its desires. Perhaps when love is sincere, it's not bad. Perhaps it is simply misinterpreted. She turned those words into a prayer. Everything changed the day her parents learned about her letters. Tears were shed. Lengthy discussions. Caution. But only dread, not anger. They were afraid of losing her. Losing command. Losing the perception of the ideal family. Josie paid attention. She sobbed. She said a prayer. I just want to love like you taught me to love, with faith, with honesty, with courage. she murmured gently at the conclusion of it all. The room became silent after those words. Her parents recognized for the first time that their little miracle was no longer a child. She was now a woman of conviction rather than revolt. The naysayers went on outside. The internet was unkind. As though she were a moniker rather than a person, strangers argued over her value. Zach, however, remained consistent, paying her discreet visits, sending letters, showing her family respect, and never going beyond. And gradually, something started to change. His patience was evident to her family. They saw that he never used foul language, made demands, or used force. He merely loved Josie with a grace that reflected their religious beliefs. And Josie, the young woman who had previously been renowned for surviving childbirth, was now enduring something more difficult: the condemnation of a society that was unable to comprehend her emotions. However, a silent strength was developing within her. As a baby, she recalled every word her mother spoke about faith and purpose, as well as every prayer that was whispered over her cot. Perhaps this love was a part of that mission, a continuation of the wonder she had always been, rather than an error. One night as winter gave way to spring, Josie stood at her window and gazed at the stars. When she was in the hospital, her parents used to pray under the same stars. She then muttered a fresh prayer, this time for serenity rather than survival. Leave it alone if this love is from you. If not, carefully remove it. She sensed it, the silent assurance of something bigger than dread, as she closed her eyes. Josie Duggar ceased to be the world's miracle that night. She became her own. What the world would say next was unknown to her. She had no idea how difficult the road would get. She was certain of one thing, though. She would rather to be misinterpreted for being honest than to be commended for acting. This was the beginning of a tale that would test religion, family, and the definition of true courage. The narrative of a young lady who dared to love when the world urged her not to. For Josie Duggar's sake, the miracle was never surviving. It was love. The peaceful evenings were short-lived. What started out as whispers quickly turned into waves, with rumors, posts, and headlines spreading more quickly than Josie could keep up. Everybody had a viewpoint. Everybody had an opinion. She never asked for the storm that had centered on the miracle child. They referred to her as careless. They referred to him as hazardous. Additionally, each word caused a bruise on her soul rather than her body. She had been raised in the spotlight, loved for surviving, and commended for her purity. Now, however, those same eyes gazed cruelly and suspiciously. Her love was scandalous to them, not pure. They saw her decision as betrayal rather than bravery. Josie experienced what it was like to be by herself in a throng for the first time. Her relatives made an effort to shield her from the commotion. Her mother, Michelle, prayed more fervently than ever, pleading for wisdom. Her father, Jim Bob, paced through restless nights, divided between fear of losing his daughter and love for her. They desired the finest. Nevertheless, the term best had become ambiguous. For Josie, best meant love, honesty, and harmony. However, best for her family meant control, appearance, and safety. Conversations were thick in the quiet nooks of their house. Not with rage, but with heartache. Josie wasn't going against her family's will. All she wanted was to be heard. Zach, meanwhile, maintained his distance out of respect for their personal space, not because he wanted to. He did not retaliate against the press. He refrained from posting, arguing, and defending. Rather, he put in more hours at work, prayed more deeply, and waited with a patience that most men couldn't handle. He was aware that this was a test of character rather than a battle against others. Nevertheless, the noise increased regardless of how quiet he remained. His life was investigated by reporters. They interviewed old friends. All of his minor transgressions were brought to light, and contorted into evidence that he wasn't worthy of her. Josie witnessed everything. Every harsh word. Every twisted tale. Every post calls her lost, stupid, and naive. She also broke. Silently. At night, she would shut her door, put her hands to her face, and tell herself things would be all right. That everything would make sense if she only remained faithful. But when the world is screaming, even faith feels vulnerable. Her siblings made an effort to console her. Jana sent a letter telling her that peace comes from the truth, not from approval. Joanna sent love notes, and Jinger called. However, the racket in her head was too loud for even their words to muffle. Josie went out to the porch one evening, the same porch where her parents used to record family events for TV. Thunder sounded quietly across the hills in the distance, and the air smelled like rain. She muttered to the heavens, "Why is it so difficult for me to act morally when my heart tells me it should?" The breeze remained silent. Something moved in her heart, albeit it was quiet and uncertain. She recalled Zach saying, "We don't shout louder to prove love. We demonstrate this by standing for longer." She made a choice that evening. Not to flee, not to conceal, but to live, in silence, truthfulness, and without regret. She started helping out at a nearby community shelter, out from the spotlight and rumors. She stayed rooted in the kind of love that demanded nothing in return, prayed with families, and assisted in feeding children. And gradually, others started to take notice. Not because she made the announcement. However, the rumors were overshadowed by her acts. Even Zach's name began to resurface, this time out of curiosity rather than rage. He was observed leading young prayers, assisting with church maintenance, and standing respectfully by others. The storm was still going strong, but it was shifting. In the meantime, hearts were also becoming softer within the Duggar household. Michelle saw her daughter return home each night, exhausted but radiant. There was a calm in her gaze that Jim Bob could not shake. They saw that she was living her faith in her own modest way, and wasn't straying from it. And Michelle eventually said it one evening during dinner, a little shakily. Perhaps she truly understands what love is. Hope returned to the discussion for the first time. Even though he was still far away, Zach sensed it. Although he had not yet been embraced by Josie's family, the barrier between them was beginning to crumble. He kept waiting without hurrying or making demands. He prayed at the start of each letter and wrote patiently at the finish. He previously wrote, "I don't want to win them over. All I want them to see is that I would rather keep Josie calm than take credit for her name." That's precisely what he did. Months went by. The seasons shifted. As is typically the case, the public gradually shifted their focus elsewhere. And something precious blossomed between them once more in the silence that ensued. Josie started going to Zach's town more frequently, but only with permission, during the day and with deference. She was reminded by each visit that romance wasn't always dramatic. At times it was straightforward. Silent walks near the churchyard, laughter over old hymns and shared prayers. However, in a society that is fixated on appearances, even simplicity can feel rebellious. The internet exploded again the day someone took a picture of them holding hands and laughing in the sun. They've remained together. The headlines cried out. The Duggars have gotten out of hand. However, Josie didn't conceal this time. She didn't say sorry. She didn't post anything. She just continued grinning. Because she wasn't attempting to please anyone for the first time. She was simply living, fearlessly, truthfully, and freely. And for some reason, that silenced the world. Love starts to triumph when it ceases to defend itself. Zach and Josie stood together in a little field close to his house that summer. The air was gentle and warm, and the sky was painted gold. There was simply the truth, no audience, no cameras. Josie gave him a glance and replied, "I'm not yet prepared to get married. However, I'm also not giving up." He grinned without surprise or disappointment. "Then I'll continue to wait," he answered plainly. Because it doesn't waste time to wait for something right. It is fostering faith. She recognized then that this was the love for which she had prayed all her life. Not too loud, not flawless, but pure, resilient, and patient. Josie was lighter than she had been in months, when she returned home that evening. Her parents witnessed it. Her siblings witnessed it. In its own quiet way, the world also started to notice it. The girl who previously battled for her life was now teaching everyone the true meaning of surviving, which is to maintain faith and goodness even in the face of adversity. Anger hardens with time, but time softens it. The storm that had encircled Josie had subsided into far-off thunder by the time another year had gone by. New scandals and stories had taken over the world. However, Josie had discreetly reconstructed herself in the shadows. She was no longer the terrified young woman who hid in whispers. Now she was stable, her eyes wiser, her faith stronger, her heart softer. She got up early every morning and went barefoot on the dewy grass of her family's property. It felt hallowed, a place of silent surrender, the same field she had played on as a child. There, she prayed for serenity rather than acceptance or recognition, tranquility with herself, harmony with her family, conquer the world that had miscalculated her. And gradually, that calm started to arrive. Things had also changed inside the Duggar house. It was a different tone, less reticent and quieter. Instead of protecting her, her parents had learnt to listen. Once her guardians, her siblings were now her buddies. At the dinner table, there was once more shared prayer, mild joking and laughing. Everyone knew that Josie was no longer the family baby, even if no one stated it out loud. She was a woman, full of charm, modest and grounded. Zach, meantime, was patient. Occasionally he paid a visit, remaining cautious and respectful. His affection had just grown up. It hadn't diminished. It existed in calm steadiness and fidelity that remained unwavering over time, without the need for words or pledges to show itself. And others started to take notice. His neighbors witnessed him leading youth programs and helping his church recover from a storm without ever putting his name next to hers. Like Josie, he was just living his life without striving for stardom. That is the nature of religion. It sparkles rather than yells. Zach and Jim Bob eventually reconnected, but not at a church service or press conference. It happened accidentally when two volunteers reached for the same supply box during a community activity. There was a tightness that might have shattered the uneasy silence. Then, however, an unexpected thing occurred, a straightforward, genuine smile. There was no need for words. A year's worth of anxiety and condemnation started to fade with that tiny act. When Jim Bob returned home that evening, Michelle noticed a tenderness in his eyes that she hadn't noticed in years. During dinner, he didn't say much, but following the prayer he just stated, "He is not who they claimed him to be." It was the start of recovery. The news was like sunlight peeping through clouds to Josie. She didn't yell or jump. All she did was close her eyes, say thank you in a whisper, and let the tears fall. Tears of calm delight, relief, and thankfulness. She wrote in her journal that evening, the same one she used to fill with suffering and uncertainty. Love doesn't always have to be fought for. It simply must remain. Weeks passed, and suddenly Zach was being invited more frequently by the family to little meals, quick visits, and get-togethers. The outside world was still in the dark, but within the Duggar household, walls were collapsing and love was restoring what fear had wrecked. And Josie felt entire again for the first time in years. Nevertheless, the recollections of the past persisted, including the stinging remarks, the harsh headlines, and the isolation. However, Josie transformed it into compassion rather than resentment. She started going to churches and schools and gently talking to young girls about courage, faith, and patience. She never gave names, never gave her the whole story. Everyone who heard her, however, was aware that this was a woman who had survived a fire and emerged with light. People's perceptions of her began to change. Not as the kid star, not as the controversial chick. However, as a representation of grace, of silent fortitude in a harsh, noisy world. Even her former critics started to change their minds. Apologies from strangers, blessings from moms who had once chastised her, and words of appreciation from young ladies who said her strength gave them hope were among the letters that arrived at the family home. Zach remained steady as the dawn, courteous, and grounded throughout it all. He never professed to have saved her life. He just strolled next to her, quietly grateful for the opportunity to now publicly love her. Josie's world felt brand new as spring arrived once more, as if each blossoming petal was a whispering, "It's time." That meant something to her. The moment had arrived for trust to become promise. However, there would be no cameras, headlines, or spectacle this time. Just love, truth, and family. The room fell silent when Josie eventually informed her parents that she was prepared to move on with Zach. Her father gazed at her with the affection of a father witnessing his daughter's first complete maturity, rather than the authority of a guardian. Glistening with tears, Michelle took her hand. They didn't have anything to say. Their quiet was a blessing in itself. It was a private announcement. Only close friends and family were aware. There were only expressions of gratitude, no interviews or media remarks. Josie reflected on the long journey that had led her here, including the suffering, the gossip, the loneliness, and the prayerful evenings, as she readied herself for what lay ahead. Each tear had been a seed, each step a test. Those seeds had now grown into something timeless. She was no longer the child of miracles. She was the woman of miracles. She had the courage to believe without evidence, to forgive without resentment, and to love without apology. The world that had before condemned her was now quiet, as it observed the girl who had formerly struggled to survive now making the morally right decision to love. Heaven grinned somewhere in the peaceful area between the earth and the stars, beyond that quietness. For Josie was at last all that she was supposed to be. The next phase of her life was ahead. One that would challenge her heart in novel ways while simultaneously rewarding her bravery in ways she could never have predicted. For the time being, she stood in the center of her created life, quietly saying to herself, "My faith remained intact. I located it." The grace vows. Gradually, spring spread across Arkansas. Every breeze felt like a whisper of fresh starts, and the air was warm enough to let the scent of wildflowers fill the Duggar house's windows. There was tranquility for the first time in years, the quiet type that comes after storms, not the ideal, TV-perfect kind. With her heart oddly at ease, Josie woke up early every morning when the sun brushed her curtains. She didn't feel anxious. She didn't feel scared. She was prepared. Even though the choice had been made months prior, it still seemed surreal. It had come so gently, like faith coming back after years of stillness, not because she questioned it. Neither she nor Zach had any big plans. They desired simplicity. One aisle under the open sky, a small gathering, a vow made in front of God, family, and the truth. Hand-picked flowers from the garden, ribbons from old storage boxes, and music selected from hymns they grew up singing were the modest preparations. Every little detail conveyed thankfulness instead of glitz. Her family collaborated while grinning in ways they hadn't seen in a while. The younger siblings placed lanterns throughout the yard, Jana assisted with the outfit, and Michelle arranged the flowers. Even Jim Bob, who had previously been in charge of all decisions, now stood silently, tearful and pleased, knowing that his tiny child had grown into something that even faith couldn't have predicted. Arrived in gold on the morning of the wedding. The field where they had decided to stand was filled with grass, wild daisies, and a little wooden cross in the middle, and sunlight flowed across it. In the distance, birds sang, and somewhere, the breeze mixed with the faint sound of laughter. There was no noise, no strangers in the crowd, and no red carpet. The only thing that was ultimately answered was love, and the sound of 1,000 prayers. Josie was wearing a little white dress that her sisters had sewed together, no crown, and no jewels as she left. Every chapter of her journey, the hospital nights, the tears, the judgment, the waiting, the forgiveness, was carried by her smile beneath her veil, which was thin enough to let sunshine through. Every stride she took in Zach's direction felt like she was traveling through time itself, past all the suffering she had gone through and toward all the tranquility she had earned. As humble as usual, Zach stood waiting, his hands shaking with wonder rather than fear. Years had passed while he waited for this moment. Through quiet, through criticism, through many tests of his faith. The suspense was over now. No reporters were present. No cameras. Only the steady pounding of two hearts that had endured everything together, and the sound of wind through the trees. The preacher gently discussed grace, emphasizing that it is about choosing love even when others think it is dumb, not about being perfect. Josie closed her eyes as he talked, allowing each syllable to fill her with the warmth of sunlight after a hard winter. There were no grandiose promises made when it came time to exchange vows, just the facts. They talked about kindness, forgiveness, and patience, the qualities that endure when the world becomes harsh. Additionally, the audience did not applaud when Zach put the ring on her finger, as though the ground itself exhaled. They just breathed, because everyone present was aware of the journey that led to this point. Josie has been viewed as weak for years. She was unshakable now, standing in front of them, not because she had won the world, but rather because she had discovered how to love it. Following the ceremony, stillness gave way to laughter. The Duggar siblings sang quietly, children ran across the field, and Josie and Zach strolled hand in hand with them, smiling and walking lightly. They had no reason to talk about the past. Behind them, everything had already been forgiven. Later that night, when the lanterns started to glow and the sky became violet, Josie took a minute to stand back and gaze at the horizon. She remembered her younger self. The young woman who had prayed to God for peace, the little girl in the hospital, the teen who was spoken about online. She came to the realization that all of her past selves had brought her to this point. All the hardships had been preparation. Each wound had turned into a portal to elegance. She prayed in a whisper, not for the wedding, but for the trip that earned her the honor. Zach joined her in the distance, their hands instinctively touching. As the last of the light dwindled below the hills, they stood silently together. Their emotions spoke for themselves. Words were unnecessary. And one reality slowly descended upon them as the land was enveloped in silent silver by the night. That true miracles might sometimes be about loving without remorse, not always about surviving the impossible. Once a youngster who struggled to survive, Josie Duggar has grown into a lady who made the decision to embrace life to the fullest. And she had finally fulfilled her promise, the one she had made to herself long before she had promised anybody else. Because love had not just found her in the end. It had carried her home, grown with her, and healed with her. The light's legacy. It seemed as though time itself had learned to move slowly past them as the years went by. Outside, everything changed quickly, new people, headlines, and sounds. But Josie and Zach's small house remained motionless and peaceful. The place wasn't a mansion. It lacked grandeur and grandeur. It was little, covered in natural ivy, painted a light white by Zach himself. And flowering on the porch were flowers that Josie had planted. Every crevice of the floor sounded like a long-answered prayer, and every nook carried a memory. They were not devoted to praise. They loved peaceful mornings with the fragrance of bread baking, the soothing laughing of little children starting to walk, and sunlight streaming in through the kitchen window. Evenings spent sitting outside beneath the stars, reflecting on their progress and the closeness of grace, were what they lived for. Josie battled the burden of expectations during their first year of marriage. There were still some whisperers. The old rumors were too much for some to forget. However, she discovered that forgiveness was the one thing that could foster peace, not the acceptance of others. The family cried upon the birth of their first child, a daughter with her mother's kind hands and brilliant eyes. Not out of sorrow, but out of wonder. Because this little life served as a real example of how love, despite any doubts, may blossom into something timeless. They gave her the name Hope, because Josie had never really clung to anything but that. Over the years, Josie developed into more than just a mother and wife. In the Duggar household, she emerged as a silent representation of bravery, someone who had endured adversity and emerged with dignity. Instead of viewing her as the frail youngest, her siblings started to view her as the person who had taught them that effort, not perfection, is what matters in life. She occasionally sat with her parents, sipping tea and giggling quietly. The old tension had vanished. Even Jim Bob, who had before been harsh and afraid for her future, now regarded her with a sort of modest respect. He had been reminded of the true meaning of faith by his daughter, who had chosen it despite being ridiculed. Gradually the years passed. Zach was active in the neighborhood, visiting the lonely, repairing roofs, and assisting families. And Josie started writing letters, her heart steady and her voice serene. Letters to misled young ladies. Girls were told in letters that they were too small, too young, and too frail to dream. Her remarks were widely heard outside of their small village. Josie Duggar gradually transformed into an inspiration, something she never dreamed of being. She didn't see it that way though. She just grinned and replied, "It wasn't me," when individuals wrote back to thank her for giving them hope. It was grace. She understood deep down that her narrative had never truly been hers alone. Every story starts with uncertainty and ends with clarity. Years later, on an October afternoon, the family reassembled in the same open field where Sarah and Zach had exchanged vows. The trees were taller, the lanterns were different, and there was more laughter. Now that she was old enough to run, their daughter spun around in the grass, her laughter resonating in the breeze. With silent awe in her gaze, Josie observed her. She was shocked by how time had transformed suffering rather than erased it. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who was pitying and being condemned. And she understood that she would only say one thing to that version of herself if she could talk to her now. Remain calm. There will be light soon. Gold and lavender hues started to darken the sky. Zach moved to stand next to her and touched her with his arm. There was no need for words. Their hearts had learned to beat in harmony, and their stillness had its own language. Josie prayed in a whisper as the sun set over the hills, not for more blessings but for thankfulness. For the tiny home. For the forgiving family. For the love that merely lived and never demanded to be understood. And it seemed as though heaven itself was grinning somewhere in that gentle twilight. Because a girl who had previously only been recognized for her frail beginnings had written a conclusion that shone brighter than any storm. People may forget the noise, the criticism, and the scandals in years to come. They will, however, never forget her story. The silent fortitude of Josie Duggar, who transformed suffering into meaning and condemnation into compassion. Her life became a message etched in faith rather than fame, that when the tiniest light continues to shine through the night, it leaves a legacy that no shadow can take away. Consequently, the promise that started out in terror ended in tranquility. The same assurance that saw Josie through her first shaky breath and into her last vow. The assurance that love in its most pure form is unfailing. Lanterns fluttered gently in the wind as night fell over the field, illuminating the grass with gold halos. With their daughter dancing close by and laughter blending with crickets, Zach pulled Josie close. It was easy. It was lovely. It fulfilled all of their prayers. And their narrative came full circle in that instant. Beneath a sky full of silent stars. With an eternal brightness. Yet without a conclusion.